Hola a todos, mi nombre es Suna y bienvenidos una vez más a este que es mi canal. El día de hoy les traigo un video bastante emocionante que me emociona muchísimo compartir con ustedes. Y es que tuve la oportunidad de conversar un rato con June Hur, quien es la autora de The Red Palace, que es un libro que leí recientemente y ustedes me han visto hablar de él en los últimos videos. Entonces, sin más que decir, espero que disfruten del video. Okay, so maybe to start with the interview video, could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I was born in Korea and then I moved when I was 3 apparently. I don't remember.
Okay.
So I went to the States and lived there because my dad was studying in the States. And then after when I was around 7, we moved to Canada. And so I pretty much grew up in Canada since I was 7.
Yeah.
And then when I was around 15, my dad finished his studies, and so we were living in Canada with my dad's student visa, our whole family. And so once that expired, we're like, oh no, like we have to apply for PR card, but it takes time.
Yeah.
So PR card is like permanent residence card,
Oh,
and so we had to go back to Korea. And so I went to high school. My parents just threw me into public school in Korea, and I didn't know much Korean.
oh my
And
God.
so
That must have
that's
been really
where,
hard.
yeah, it was hard, but I also had the most fun because like
Oh, okay.
Korean high school is so fun, but especially because no one expected me to do well in my studies. Because they're like, oh, she doesn't know any Korean.
Mm,
So yeah, there wasn't as much pressure on me to do well in school. It was just more like I
okay.
just had to survive. So I made lots of good friends there. I made lots of good memories. But like during Yaja, I think it's like night school or something. So during that time, I would write. I would write my books, and then after I came back to Canada for university, and I've been trying. Universities is when I started to try to get published, and
All
I've
right.
been writing then.
Let's talk about a little bit about The Red Palace, which is your most recent published book. Where did you get the idea for writing The Red Palace?
So since I began writing my first book all the way back in 2016, um, I, I was researching and I came across the story of Prince Hado,
Mm-hmm.
and I've heard about his tragedy and
Yeah.
how he died since I was a kid, but I was never that interested. But then when I finally got to know more about how he died and just the really sad relationship he had with his father, the
Mm-hmm.
King Yeongjo. I think that I've always wanted to write about him ever since then, but I didn't know how to approach his story.
Okay.
So in the early days, like I'd write the story through his point of view, or I'd try writing the story through Lady
Oh.
Haegyang's point of view, and each
Mm.
time I'm like, oh, it doesn't feel right. Something
Yeah.
feels off, and yeah, and so finally, maybe 2 years ago, my editor was kinda like, "Oh, you wanna write about a secret royal investigator
Yeah.
and a palace nurse?" And she's like, "Why don't you write, like, a romance about them?" Like,
Oh.
and then it clicked. I'm like, "A romance with, like, a palace nurse, an
Yeah.
investigator?" And then she kinda views Prince Hado's life through a keyhole. So it's almost like she's, like, kinda peering in,
Yeah.
watching his tragedy unfold, but there's a distance. So it
Mhm.
allows me to share his story a little bit without making the whole book about him.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
he's a bit of a controversial figure. Like he
Mm.
was violent, but there's also a lot of mental health problems he struggled
Yeah, yeah,
with.
yeah. Mhm.
And I really didn't want to, um, suggest that people with mental health problems can be are violent.
Mm.
So I didn't want to touch that, kind of stereotype, but I didn't feel capable enough to just like do justice to that story, and so it was really nice being able to keep that distance.
I've never heard of the prince, and I was like wondering as I was reading the book, like, is this like an actual like story, like figure? And then I read like the background at the end. I was like, oh, okay, it all makes sense now.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting. Like, I really, really enjoyed the story, and I like without spoilers, I did not guess the ending. I didn't.
Yes.
Yeah, that was also a surprise. I was like, oh, I was not expecting this like at all. Oh, and I read the extra like bonus
Yeah,
chapter you
yeah,
released today. Like I woke up today and I was just like
yeah.
browsing Instagram and I came across your story and I was like, oh, the new chapter is really. I was like,
Oh
oh,
my
the
gosh.
new chapter. Like, what is this? I loved it. It's so
Oh,
cute.
so
Like
good.
I just you just gotta love and ship
Oh,
Hyuna and Ojin. Like I just
yeah.
love them. Yeah.
I was I love romance, but I'm always so embarrassed when I write it. So when I sent that short story off to my editor, I was like, "Oh, no." I was like dying. I was like, "No, don't read it."
No. So have you always wanted to write like thriller mystery kind of
Mm.
stories?
Actually, yeah, it's interesting because I've been writing for more than 10 years, but
Mhm.
from like 90% of that time, I wrote romance, like historical
Oh,
romance
really?
set
Okay.
in England. Yeah, like kind of like I was inspired by Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre.
Oh,
And so I
all right.
always aspired to write those kind of books. But then after it didn't really work out publishing wise, I kind of went into Korean history and I fell in love with it. And so, first of all, like writing mystery, I chose it because it really helps me with plot structure. Because
Okay.
I really struggle with plot, like, giving the heroine something to pursue in the story.
Mm.
And so, mystery was a really fun way for me to learn how to structure a story. I also just love reading and watching mystery shows growing up. And I think the biggest reason is that Korean history is like a mystery to me. So I grew up
Yeah.
not knowing about Korean history, and so a lot of the mystery cases involved in my book, it's inspired by history, and so it's like mystery becomes my vehicle into exploring more about Korean history and so on. There's just so many questions involved in history
Mhm.
that I really enjoy kind of unlocking and getting to know more about.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever read another like historical novel set in Korea. So I feel like in general a lot of people don't really know about
Yeah.
Korean history and I mean much less that Korea was not even Korea until like the early
Hmm.
1900s. It was Joseon
Hmm.
before that. How do you think the society itself like affected how you
Hmm.
develop like Hyun's character?
Mm. So I studied a lot of British history, and so when I went into Korean history, it was really interesting to see just how patriarchy has affected
Mhm.
society in sometimes similar ways. Like in Chosun Korea, women in general, respectable women,
Yeah.
were supposed to stay at home, and then the
Mm.
men public kind of belonged to the men. And so when women were unable to kind of follow that rule, where women belong to the inner sphere and they have to stay at home, that kind of idea. So Hyun, she is an illegitimate daughter, and so
Yeah.
in Chosun Korea, they were like considered very low, even though her dad is like upper class.
Mhm.
And as a nurse, she has to interact with not only female patients, she interacts with men as well, like
Yeah,
male
yeah.
physicians, male patients, and so by through that interaction with men, she's automatically considered like polluted.
Mm.
So the highest kind of rank a nurse can achieve in Chosen Korea was to enter the palace, to become a palace
Mm,
nurse.
okay.
And so I found the tension really interesting in that, Chosen culture tells Hyun, you are the lowest of the low,
Mm,
and yet she works in the palace now. And
yeah.
so it's considered respectable. And so I found that tension really interesting that is created by Chosen society,
Mhm.
and a lot of this is steeped in like Confucianism. Playing around with that, I found really fun.
What did the writing process look like
Mhm.
for this book? Like, was it any different from your previous books? Was there a lot of research behind it?
The Red Pause was actually the easiest book to write,
Oh,
mainly because with The Silence of Bones, which is my first book, and The Forest of Stolen Girls, which is my second book, both of them, it was really hard to just look for resources. But with the Red Palace, I had the memoirs of Lady Haegyang. So
mm,
like Lady Haegyang is the wife of the prince, and so she has an entire memoir written. And so I was able to really use her account of the Prince Hado to kind of mold my story around the events that occurred. So having that resource was really made writing really easy for me. And also mainly because it's my first time writing romance with the Red Palace. And so I think just that the fun of writing a romance also made the process really smooth for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I really enjoyed the romance part. It's almost like I kind of wish there was a bit more, but like considering the times, I'm like,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, it's like, oh my god, that's like scandal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you know the ending before starting to write the book, or did it
Mm,
like kind of change throughout the story?
mm, I didn't know the killer. S-
Oh, that's
Yeah,
interesting. Okay.
he,
They.
they, yeah, I'll keep it vague. That person um changed with each draft. And
Really?
so I
Oh,
didn't really know the killer until maybe like this third draft. Whenever I write endings, like the ending is always very like I always just have a placeholder chapter. So I just like
mm,
write anything randomly and just like
yeah,
stick it to the end just so I have an ending. And so yeah, it changed a lot. And then like as I draft, I get a better idea of the story, better idea of the killer and their motives. And then knowing more of the story helps you really solidify the last chapter. So I didn't really know the last chapter going in.
Oh, that's interesting. I would have thought that because it's like a murder mystery, you would have like known, like, oh, okay, yeah, this is
Yeah.
the ending and this is what I'm working towards. But that's very interesting
Mhm.
to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I, I
Okay.
I usually outline the mystery. So like I think I know it, but then with each draft,
Yeah.
yeah, it changes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the publishing process? I think that
Mhm.
people in general also interested, like readers are always interested in that.
Oh yeah, it's oof. Yeah, it's a it's for some people it's quick. For many people
Mm,
it's a very long journey. So in order to get published by, for example, the big publishing houses like HarperCollins,
yeah.
Random House, Macmillan, and so on, they want you to have an agent, a literary agent. So
Mm,
a literary agent represents your work, and you don't give them any money. They make 15% off of the works they're able to sell for you to publishers. And so I think for the first like 10 years, like I was trying to land an agent,
mm,
but no one was interested. And then I wrote my Korean fiction, and then my current agent, is a Korean American, and she was really interested in Korean history, and so she offered representation. And
mm,
then we kind of worked on my first book for like half a year ish, and just revising and fixing it up and making it as strong as possible. And then we submitted it to publishing houses, so different houses, different editors. And my editor, Emily Settle, she was interested in my first book. And so what happens next is, even though an editor of a publishing house is interested in your book, it has to then go to this thing called acquisition meeting. So an
oh,
acquisition
okay.
meeting is when the editor will kind of fight for your book, being like, I want this book
Mm,
because this and this and this, and I think it will make this amount of money, and so on. And then at the meeting, there's people from sales, marketing, and just like everyone
mm,
in the publishing team who decide on these stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then so they finally they decided to buy my book, and so they gave me a 2 book deal. So that means like they buy the first book that I've already written, and they put me under contract for a second book that I have not written yet. And
Okay.
so yeah, that's how I got started in publishing.
Oh, right. So it's really out of hand. Like, I mean, you
Yeah.
just say, "Oh, okay, agent, here's my
Yep.
book,"
Yep.
and then it's even like out of the agent's
Yep.
hands. So it's like,
It's out of
oh,
our control once it's like
yeah,
with the agent and out to publishers. Yeah.
wow,
So a lot of writers who are on submission with their manuscripts, it's like it's very stressful, very
yeah,
anxiety inducing,
mm,
because it's like almost nothing is in your control, right?
yeah, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
it can get really hard.
As you were writing the Red Palace, you said that, I mean, you had this like trial and error period, and once you landed on, okay, I'm gonna write about this palace nurse and the investigator.
Mhm.
How do you start getting to know your characters?
Mm, good question. So what I usually do for all my books is, it's really important for me to take something that I'm currently struggling with
All right.
and then wrap a story around it. So like what that really helps me to keep on writing when, for example, I might get uninspired. So for example, in the Red Palace, I was really struggling with envy, like just professional envy, like always wondering like, oh, am I good enough? What do I need to achieve to feel
Yeah.
like a real author? Because I've struggled with like imposter syndrome a lot. Just the idea that our identity is based on what we can always produce. And so I think that was the thing I was currently struggling with. And so I wanted to build a character and wrap it around my own personal struggle. And so that's how Hyun came about, where she's like super ambitious. She feels like she has to prove herself. She feels like if she doesn't achieve things, then that she's worthless. And so that's how I got to know her. Like obviously, like I just take a sliver of my struggle, and then
Yeah.
that inspires her character through the book. And then for Ajin, the male character, I got to know him based on the question of what would it take for Hyun to fall for a guy? It's like she has a lot of baggage. Like her dad is like
It does.
horrible, yeah, and she feels insecure, and she's really obsessed about like her status, and so it's like, what would it take for her to fall for a nobleman,
Yeah.
a guy from the upper class? So the guy she would fall for is someone who's respectful, someone who respects her mind, and who doesn't see an issue with her social status. And so that's how I ended up creating him. And then I got to know him more, and then I added backstory, and it kind of just happens organically.
Oh, and what about the side characters? Like, oh my god, what was it? June? What's her name, right? Yeah. Like the cousin slash best friend.
Yeah.
And what about like historical figures, like the prince and
Mhm.
the wife and those
Yeah.
kind of characters?
So for the prince and the wife, definitely the memoirs helped me. Reading the wife's memoir kind of gave me an idea of who I'd imagine the prince to be like, and the wife as well. And then for Jian, it was more like, this was my first time writing a romance, and I was having so much fun. So she kind of just like, she was like basically me projecting myself into the story. I was just like, oh,
Okay.
I love romance, and I would spend all my money on romance books. And so
Yeah.
she was just like the character that was inspired by me for the first time, having so much fun with writing romance again.
No, I really like her character, and it's like, I mean, she was their biggest cheerleader.
Yeah,
And I can just imagine you being their cheerleader. Like, yes.
Yeah.
If you could write a spin-off series of this same story,
Ooh,
who would you choose? Like, it has to be a side character, not Ojin.
yes. Okay. Okay. I like. I think Jiren would be fun,
Yeah.
but also kind of she'd probably be a bit ridiculous, too ridiculous for like a mystery. But she's like she has a lot of fear.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think she'd be fun.
I
So
think
probably
so. I
June.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah, she'd be like the reluctant detective.
But like, since you said that you wrote a few chapters from Haegyong's point of view or the prince,
Mhm.
I would be like very interested
Yes,
to read that
that's
too.
true.
Yeah,
That
because there's so much
yeah,
mystery revolving these two characters.
yeah,
I
that
think it
would
would be very
be.
interesting. Like, yeah.
I think Haegyang would be a good main character too.
Right?
He has
I
to go
agree.
through a lot. Yeah.
So you mentioned you like romances, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite authors, book recommendations that you've read recently?
Hmm. I I really like. I think her name's like Emily Henry.
Beach
So
read.
yeah.
People we meet on vacation. Yes.
Yep. She like I've read so many romance, and then I stopped for a long time. But I think Emily Henry is able to really capture romance in a way that I can enjoy again.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy her.
When you're writing a mystery novel,
Mhm.
like, do you also like go in and read other novels in the similar genre, or do you like stay
Mm,
away from it when
mm.
you're writing?
I usually stay away,
Mm.
mainly because like reading starts to feel like work, because
Okay.
I'm writing my book, a mystery, and then when I'm reading a mystery, it's more like I always want to change things because I'm like, oh, they do it so well here, and then I want to change it. And I want to stick to my own idea as much as possible. And so I usually read thrillers once I'm done my book and I've sent it off. And that's when I really binge read thriller books. But my favorite mystery writer is Tana French. Her mystery books are like really big. she's really good. And so what I usually do, because I can never guess the killer in her books, is I read the end, the last chapter.
No!
I see who the killer is. Yeah,
you do.
and then I read it from chapter 1 to figure out like, oh, how did she like build the case to accuse the killer in the end? But she does it because I can never figure it out anyways. I only do it for educational purposes.
Oh my god. But I have a friend and she's like, I mean, she starts the book and once she's like kind of like, oh, this is a bit dragging, she goes to the end, she reads the last like 2 chapters, and if she likes the ending, she would push herself to read it, and she's like, oh, I'm done with this book. I'm like,
oh,
dude,
so
I cannot do that.
Oh
like,
my
I'm just like,
gosh.
no.
Yeah, I don't do that for the fun of reading. I just do it because I'm like, I want to be a better mystery writer.
Yeah. Do you have any like specific title recommendations from Tara French? What's her name? Because I don't think I've heard about her.
Yeah, Tana French. She's a British writer. Let me think. What was it called? In the Woods. Yeah, that's her.
Oh, wait, I think I've heard about it.
Usually mystery thrillers are like shorter and more fast paced, but hers feels more like a season 1 of a really intense and complex mystery show. Like, have you watched Broadchurch?
I haven't.
Okay, so it's kind of like those like really, very complex mysteries. So it feels like it's real because it's so intense. Yeah, and she does like so much research and everything. But yeah.
So I feel like most writers are also readers, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah. So you should like, do you usually read in your free time, or do you have any other hobbies?
Yeah. So yeah, it's funny because like when I got published, I think there's so much pressure to like meet deadlines. I think for a while I didn't read as much as I used to. But then now I really try to stick to a more like a schedule where I like before I sleep I need to read at least like a chapter or 2 or 3. So that's really helped pick up reading again. And then other hobbies is just binging on Korean dramas. Yeah.
Do you have any Korean drama recommendations?
So for historical, I would recommend The Red Sleeve. And The Red Sleeve is a historical drama that takes place after the Prince Hado incident. So it's about Prince Hado's son. So he grows up.
Really?
Yeah, he's like basically the criminal son, right? And he's a prince. He's gonna become a king, and it's a forbidden romance between him and a court lady, and it's so good. So yeah, it's really well done. Very romantic, very angsty. And for a modern drama, right now I'm watching 2125 or something like that. And it's a Korean drama that revolves around a girl who does fencing, and the male lead, he's a sports journalist, and it's very nostalgic because it's set in like 1980s or something like that in Korea, but it's really well done. Yeah.
I kind of almost want to watch the historical drama you mentioned as a sequel to the Red Palace. Like kind of like okay,
yeah,
maybe we'll find Hyun and Ojin somewhere in the background. Like, oh, I see you,
cameo.
Yeah. Do you have any unpublished or unfinished manuscripts?
I
know you're publishing a new one next year, right? Like I saw on Goodreads there's like a title, and I'm like, there's a new book coming out.
Yeah. I have like 1, 2, maybe like 3 unpublished works. The first one is like the story that I tried to get published and it didn't work out.
The romance.
Yeah, it's like a romance, women's fiction. And it's about a female prostitute in Britain. Right. Yeah, because I was really interested in I forget, it's like Contagious Diseases Act, and it was when like it was just a really difficult time for women who worked in that field. And it's just like her journey to self-discovery and stuff like that. And then the other 2 were just Regency romances. I wrote that when I was a teenager. Probably will never get it published.
Uh,
But yeah, those are the 3 books that I
do you
wrote.
know Bridgerton?
Yes, I
Yeah,
do.
have you read the books or watched
Yeah, I
the
wrote it when I
series?
was much younger. Yeah, I read all of her books.
Oh, you did? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because I recently discovered them, I guess, thanks to the series, but I haven't watched the Netflix adaptation. But I did read all the 8 books last year, and now I'm like
Oh,
reading the
wow.
the prequel series. That's
Yeah.
like, yeah, and I'm like I'm all in into
Yeah,
it.
she's it's so funny and like so
Yeah, they're
lighthearted
so
and
fun.
fluffy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, they're like the perfect read to read between
Mhm.
like intense, like heavy,
Yes.
big
Yes.
books. I'm like, oh yeah, I want something like lighthearted. Julia Quinn is my like go-to author
Oh
for
yeah,
that.
she's so lighthearted. Yeah.
How long on average does it take you to write a book?
Uh, so before I got published, it was like 2, 3 years because I would
Okay.
write the draft and like also do research, and then I would have a bunch of like other writers like critique it, and then I would edit it,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
so it was a long process. But then once I got published and I'm working with my editor, it's a very tight timeline. So like I'm only given like a little less than a year.
Oh,
So
okay.
usually I try to begin researching like when the idea first comes up. And I'll research, and then when I sell the book, then that's when I begin drafting. So the first draft I'll usually try to send out like within maybe 4 months. So it'll be a really,
Okay.
really rough
Yeah,
draft.
yeah, yeah.
And then my editor will send in notes, and then from there maybe like another 2 months or 3 months to write the third draft, and then maybe a month or two to polish it up, and then that's when like I submit it officially, and they send it off to copy edits, which is like
Mm.
when another copy editor starts like editing my work. And so not a lot of time, so it's like less than a year.
I think I mentioned it in my first email. I read The Red Palace in just like 2 days, which was
Yeah.
basically 2 sittings. Like I sat down
Yeah.
one night, I was like, oh, I'm gonna start reading this book. And I read like 41% of it. And I was like, okay, this is like
Wow.
fast paced. And the next morning I woke up and I was like, dude,
Yeah.
I just have to finish this. And I finished it. And then I'm like
Oh
how
my
much
gosh.
work did it go into this book? And I'm here just reading it in 2 sittings. And I sometimes I feel a little bit bad, but
Oh,
I
it's
just
okay.
couldn't put it down.
It
I
means
literally,
I did
yeah,
an okay job.
like I really couldn't put it down. But and then
Oh,
I'm
I'm
just
so
like
glad.
thinking like, is this okay? Like, should
Yeah,
I take
it's
it a bit like slower?
oh
Like,
no, it's okay. Uh, my goal is to be as fast paced, because usually my other 2 books were a bit slower, and so I'm like,
mm.
with this book, I want to be really fast paced, and so
It
it
is. It
worked.
is.
Yay! I'm
I
so
I can
glad.
confirm it is.
I'm so glad to hear.
And then you drop the bonus epilogue, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, this is it. Is that a cherry on top of the cake? This is what I needed.
Oh,
Totally.
thank you for reading it.
If you weren't a writer, what do you think you would be?
Around 2016, I actually almost gave up on writing, and because it wasn't working out, and so I was like,
No.
okay, I'm just gonna put writing aside. And I was back then I was tutoring a lot of Korean students, so I was like, you know what, like I should just go into teaching. And
Oh,
so
okay.
I went back to school and I got TESOL, so it's like teaching English as
Mm-mm.
a second language. And then so I started teaching for a few months, and so I'd probably be a teacher if not a writer, but I'd also be really stressed because I'm like super introverted and I'm a hermit. And so going to class to teach like 20 students every day was so stressful.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like
yeah.
lesson plan, oh my goodness. Like I respect teachers so much. I
Mm.
like I know I have like some capacity to teach, but it's like it was so hard. But I'd probably do teaching because I don't know what else I would do otherwise.
Yeah, because you were a history major, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you always like want to major in history?
Mainly because I went to university only because I wanted to become a better history writer. Because
Oh,
like
okay.
yeah, I began writing like when I was 12, like Pride and Prejudice. And then when I began to take it more seriously, I was like, okay, I want to write really good historical fiction. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna study history and literature at university. So I become a better writer and a better like historian.
So maybe to start wrapping it up, what can we expect from you in the near future?
So I have my fourth book, A Crane Among Wolves, coming out in 2024. But I do have something like a shorter piece coming out next year. It hasn't been announced yet, so you can keep your eyes out for that.
Thank you so much for your time, the space, and I'm sure the viewers will also appreciate it. But yeah, I had a really good time. I hope you did too.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I love chatting with you.
But yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Y bueno chicos, eso fue el video del día de hoy. Háganme saber en los comentarios si les gustó este tipo de video. De hecho tengo uno que hice ya hace unos meses también con el autor Grady Hendrix y me gustaría poder traerles más conversaciones con autores de este tipo, así como conversaciones un poco informales tal vez. Pero sí, yo me divertí muchísimo hablando con autora y espero que ustedes también. Y muchísimas gracias por ver el video. Recuerden suscribirse si no lo han hecho todavía y yo los veré muy pronto con un nuevo video. ¡Chao!